On Saturday, April 4th, 2015, police officer Michael Slager shot and killed Walter Scott after a routine traffic stop. A passerby recorded the whole incident on his cell phone. The following is a clip from that video. While there's more to the video, this 9.5-second clip contains the answer to one of the most important questions in this case. Did Scott grab the officer's taser? Officer Slager claimed that it was because Scott grabbed his taser that he feared for his life. Watching this clip, it seems impossible to tell whether or not Scott did grab the taser. In fact, everything happened so fast that it's near impossible to process anything beyond Officer Slager shooting Scott. Both CNN and NBC took a crack at breaking down this video. CNN even brought in Frank Piazza, a professional video analyst from Legal Audio, to analyze it. They asked him if there was ever a taser in Scott's hand on the video. Piazza said, "If there is, we sure can't see it." For this conclusion, he was relying on a frame in which what was later identified as the taser could be seen on the ground behind Officer Slager. NBC highlights a frame in which the taser wire is stretched between the two men. The caption under it reads, "Scott has been hit by Slager's taser." This conclusion is drawn from the apparent assumption that the only way for Scott to have been entangled in the wire was if Officer Slager had deployed the taser in his direction. Neither of these analyses offered anything concrete or credible to show whether or not Scott actually did grab the taser. So I decided to analyze the video myself. I wanted to see if there was anything which could actually prove whether Scott grabbed the taser or whether Officer Slager was lying. Because the event took place over such a short period of time, it was impossible to see enough detail to reach an informed opinion. It seemed the most logical first step was to slow the video enough to catch more of the detail. When I did this, I was surprised to see something that nobody in the media and almost nobody on the internet was talking about. Take a look for yourself. If you were paying attention to Scott's arm, you may have noticed that he appeared to make a throwing gesture. Here it is again, zoomed in frame by frame. So, if Scott was throwing something, what was it? Here's the clip again, slowed and with a few frames added to the end. Notice how something lands behind Officer Slager and tumbles away from the two men. Here's a close-up of that object. And here it is enhanced. According to the Post-Courier, a South Carolina newspaper, it is apparently Slager's taser. Besides Scott's making the throwing gesture, is there any other explanation as to how it got there? In CNN's analysis, interviewer Randy Kay says, "You also see something seems to fall or come off the officer. It's not clear whether she is suggesting that Officer Slager dropped it, or whether it fell from his holster, or some other similar scenario. However, this scenario does not fit with where the taser landed or how it moved afterward. Whether it had been dropped or fell from the holster, it would have landed much closer to Officer Slager's feet, and would, most likely, never have traveled as far as it did. Furthermore, even if it were possible for it to have traveled that far after falling, it would have done so in hops or bounces. It would not have tumbled along as it did. This leads us to a second explanation. Officer Slager tossed it. If Officer Slager had tossed it, one would expect that between the time the two men separate and the time the taser lands, one of Slager's arms would be visible behind him. As can be seen from these 4 frames, his arms remain in front of him until the taser lands and starts to move away. Remember NBC's claim that the taser wire stretching between the two men showed that Scott had been hit by the taser? This is the frame that they relied on for that claim. It seemed to me that determining which man was on the prong end of the wire and which was on the cartridge end would provide a more complete answer to the question, did Scott grab the taser? Notice how the wire does stretch between the two men. The first question that springs to mind is, if Officer Slager did fire the taser at Scott, how did the wire then become attached to him also? Had Officer Slager fired the taser at Scott, he would have held the weapon out from his body and pointed it away from himself. This means that the wire would have been at least an arm's length away from him when he fired. Once the taser is fired, the wire, along with the prongs, is going to be traveling away from the officer. Nothing short of magic bullet theory could explain how the cartridge end of the wire then reversed directions and connected itself to him. We also have this. This is just 8 frames earlier. It doesn't show which end of the wire Officer Slager was attached to, but it does show just how entangled in the wire he was. The Post-Courier has an enhanced version of this frame which shows the wire running down to the officer's leg. Now, not only do we have the cartridge reversing course, but also moving across the officer's body, then continuing backwards. Again, the only way to explain this is magic bullet theory. There's also this black streak. This is the taser cartridge. Watch how it seems to bounce up and down as the two men struggle. Notice how it comes to a rest in front of the officer. If the cartridge end of the wire were wrapped around him, one would expect to see the cartridge come to a rest at his side, not almost a foot in front of him. Furthermore, notice how it comes to rest as Scott completes his throwing gesture. If the officer was so entangled in it, it would have continued to bounce around as he went for his gun. Now let's watch what the cartridge does as Scott takes off running. Notice how the cartridge is never more than 6 to 8 feet behind him as he runs. If he were attached to the prong end of the wire, the cartridge would most likely be much farther behind him, if it followed him at all. This is because the law enforcement version of the taser comes with a wire that is between 25 and 35 feet long. In other words, if Scott were attached to the prong end, one would expect to see the wire stretch between Scott's leg and the cartridge, not the officer's chest. It would therefore be more logical to conclude that it was Officer Slager and not Scott who was attached to the prong end of the wire. So what does all of this have to do with whether or not Scott grabbed the taser? Well, if Officer Slager was on the prong end of the wire, that would mean that the taser was deployed in his direction. Assuming that he would not intentionally point it at himself and pull the trigger, it would demonstrate that there was a struggle for the taser and that Scott had gained at least partial, if not full control of it. One final thing to point out. Considering that a taser in the hands of a suspect is viewed as a danger to the officer, why would Slager willingly toss his away? Even with it behind him and Scott in front of him, he has got to know that there's a very real possibility that Scott could still get a hold of it and use it on him. It seems really odd that he would just toss his away. Does this amount to justification for the shooting? For me, the answer to that question is going to depend on a lot more than just this video. For example, when he began shooting, was Officer Slager aware that Scott no longer had control of the taser? This is a question that can't be answered by this video. Also, what does Officer Slager's reaction time tell us? It only took 1.84 seconds from the time Scott appeared to have gained control of the taser until the time Officer Slager fired his first shot. That's not a lot of time. What surprises me is just how few people notice the throwing gesture. Like most of these cases, there's more here than can be seen on the surface. There's more than the media is telling us. Most people seem to have jumped on the bad cop bandwagon. Nobody seems to have bothered to go back and check the evidence for themselves. Most just seem to accept that what the media has told us about this video is all there is. They seem to want to start and end with the conclusion. There is no taser because we can't see it. The truth in this case is this. All the evidence points to, yes, Walter Scott did grab Officer Slager's taser. Enough said.